Welcome back to Regency Rumors. It's time for some historical yappin'. I'm Dr. Kayla Jones, and here on my channel, I explore period dramas, history, and historical fiction. And I'm not gonna lie, I am nervous about making this video and some of the comments that I could get. And while you might have thought that today's video was just about this, it's really gonna be about this and how modern depictions in period dramas and historical fiction of hypermasculine groups in the past have led us to whatever the heck this is. I think it's no surprise that we are in the age of the bro, and content like reality stars fighting retired boxers to huge fanfare in massive arenas is bigger than ever. Gladiator has returned from a 24-year pause in Gladiator 2, and the fights are bigger and badder than ever.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
I feel like I've seen a load of discourse on historical inaccuracies to do with the boats in the Colosseum or rhinos or monkeys or weaponry when it comes to these combat-oriented period dramas. But what I rarely see is people talking about how, for the majority of the past, the lack of modern medicine meant that life was a lot harder than today, and death was much easier to come by. This strive for hypermasculinity and macho man syndrome can sometimes result in judging women or minorities or worse, violence.
Look, if a woman asks you how your day was, she's plotting to ruin your life! Stay vigilant.
I want to be transparent by saying I am not a historian of the ancient world. My research is highly multidisciplinary, and I'm mostly anchored in Welsh history and tourism. But what I do know about heritage and media is that there's quite a leap between what we perceive to be authentic about the past, often based on film, television, and advertisements through the years, and what actual history or archaeology tells us is the case. For example, with hypermasculine groups such as Gladiators or Vikings, the remains we have unearthed tell us a story about their health, fitness, and lifespan, and it's pretty different to what we see on screen. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm a small channel and I'd really appreciate it. Now, let's get into it. Going by Hollywood, we love seeing strong men fight on screen. I mean, who doesn't? I'm more into men who can't express their feelings or lock their wives in the attic than rough and tumble guys. I really should unpack that at some point, I think. But I'll most definitely watch a historical action flick here and there. Like romance tropes that we come to identify, so too do these action stories have characters that follow a stereotypical arch. Gladiators are often hardcore lone wolves, fighting for their honor and freedom with abs of steel and stoicism no therapist could break. Vikings were all brutish warriors that pillaged and plundered without mercy, and knights, those noble romantics in shining armor astride horses, are ready to defend yon damsel's honor and virtue at the drop of a handkerchief. The only problem is these depictions are more a work of fiction and carefully considered imagery created by much later generations, the Victorians, than being the actual truth. So I'm going to start talking about what we know about gladiators. First and foremost, gladiators were enslaved. Their lives were strictly controlled. Their outcome was often bleak. I think the average person is aware that gladiators were enslaved from films like Ridley Scott's Gladiator, but that fact seems to be brushed off a lot, or the prospect of fighting your way to freedom seems either exhilarating or romanticized in some ways to audiences. It feels like people do not treat the gravity of slavery comparably between groups like gladiators and those affected by the transatlantic slave trade. I'm not trying to compare those two, that one is worse or better or anything like that, but there are people that bring up examples of gladiators being well fed and clothed or being well trained and try and soften the blow of gladiators' enslavement. But when people do this, it sounds like they're talking about livestock being fed well, because that was a part of the owner's income. Like, that doesn't make it sound better. Or the fact that if you were lucky enough to live and fight well, you could earn your freedom and might go on and have a family or a full life someday. But none of this negates the fact that these men were enslaved. They were enslaved. They were at their highest level of absolute vulnerability in being enslaved too. So thinking of gladiators with a level of unadulterated strength and something to be admired or aspire to leaves out the very real reality that these people didn't have autonomy, and there's nothing cool or exciting about that. So, what do we know about the incredible strength of gladiators from archaeological studies? Our assumption today would be that they filled themselves with protein, 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 just like a good gym bro, a carnivore diet all the way. Paul Mescal was interviewed about what he ate for Gladiator 2, and this is what he had to say: how they survived this level of violence that we have no real comprehension of today in a sporting context. The only way you can do that is if you're robust and able to take the impact of near-death experiences on a day-to-day basis. So then it just meant lifting heavy things for a long time and eating lots of chicken. A study from a dig in Turkey that they believe are bodies of gladiators in that area showed that they ate mostly a vegetarian diet of beans, barley, and legumes. Legumes. I always mess up a word in every single one of these videos, and this was going to be it, wasn't it? For this particular location, I don't think they found much of a difference between what the general population ate and the gladiators' diets. However, I will say, here's something clever that we have adapted into our diets today. In eating mostly vegetables and carbs, gladiators would not have had much calcium. So what they found is that they drank concoctions of either charred wood or bone ash, both of which were high in calcium. Today, we would do things like drink milk or take supplements instead. So clearly, the Romans knew a thing or two about how the body worked and what it needed to survive brutal fights. Archaeology also suggests that there was quite a bit of knowledge of healing because some of these bodies showed past injuries, most likely from combat, that were treated and healed. The biggest misconception is that these gladiators were absolutely ripped all the time and lifting weights constantly. And that's not to say that they wouldn't have had to train or pick up heavy objects or had muscles, but more just that what archaeologists are finding is that they believe gladiators were larger men with a layer of fat protection. Back in 2008, Archaeology magazine interviewed Carl Groschmidt, a paleopathologist, on gladiators' diets, and he said, gladiators needed subcutaneous fat. A fat cushion protects you from cut wounds and shields nerves and blood vessels in a fight. If I get wounded, but just in the fatty layer, I can fight on. It doesn't hurt much, and it looks great for the spectators. Gladiators were often larger because increased body mass allowed them to endure fights longer, making their matches more entertaining for spectators. Slim individuals could be quickly incapacitated by serious injuries, rendering them less than valuable in the arena. Being bulky, rather than lean and muscular, offered a protective layer of fat, which could prevent critical injuries from superficial cuts and help ensure prolonged battles that people are going to want to come back and watch over and over again. Another archaeological find in York in 1993 of mass graves of men under the age of 45 are thought to possibly be gladiators as well. There were 80 bodies that they found that they suspect were either gladiators, soldiers, or criminals whose injuries correlate with those who died as entertainment at a local arena. They suspect that most of them had been in combat or battle before. There are a lot more questions than answers with this dig, but there is a chance all of them were executed, that some of them it was like a mercy killing. Archaeologists found that on the few suspected gladiator burial sites that some of them were left disabled from fights before their deaths, others had limbs amputated, and others died with just one strike. The sad truth is that a lot of these gladiators died young. They died awful deaths, and if they did survive, then they sustained lifelong injuries that they had to deal with. When we look at the archaeological proof, this was a really dangerous, unstable position to be in life, and no amount of muscles and glory can really make up for that. When I was researching this video, I mostly relied on research articles, but I was wanting a few news articles on gladiators or Vikings that maybe talked about what we know about their diets based on archaeology. Instead, I was inundated with posts about gladiator fitness courses, supplements, and weight loss drugs. Meal plans to eat like a gladiator today, how to have a gladiator mindset. There again, that's where it feels bizarre to combine your brand with the lives of ancient slaves. There's all these images and icons of big burly men with ripped muscles because this is all based on ways to make money off of us. There is so much missing context and actual research when it comes to coupling this historical group to Gladiator protein cookies. There is a Jeep called Gladiator, Gladiator security, Gladiator car care products, Gladiator chocolate smoothies, Gladiator tool and DIY kits, a TV show called Gladiator that pits the fittest contestants against professional strongmen. Alongside this alpha wolf stuff that is going around, it feels like gladiators have been co-opted with this whole hustle culture, work out multiple times a day, get up at 3 a.m. and take 500 supplements fad that is now prevalent online. Many fitness programs use the gladiator archetype to market intense, high stamina workout routines. For instance, the Spartacus workout, inspired by the Star's TV shows Spartacus, Gods of the Arena, is marketed as a way to develop arena-worthy physiques and emphasizes a warrior's strength and stamina. Similarly, other gladiator-themed workouts promote extreme fat loss and endurance through high-intensity interval training, capitalizing on the image of gladiators as peak physical specimens. So even though we've got no evidence of this go hard all day, work out till you pass out mentality being equated with historical gladiators, people are being sold that. Unless you would like to equate that mindset with slavery and not actually having the autonomy to do what you want with your day. Do you see how weird that sounds? We need to stop doing that. It's weird. I'm not making the case that these products shouldn't exist or that gladiators in films need to be historically accurate and that we should take out all the fun of masculinity and strength and combat. What I am saying is that in the same way women are inundated with images of perfectly photoshopped thin models and actresses and are thrown advertisements with weight loss supplements, skincare, fad treatments, it's clear that these images of gladiators are also being used in marketing mainly towards men with the subtle messaging of like, that's what a real man is, and if you don't live up to that, well, here's some products to make you feel like you could. I think we should be able to see gladiators as still these impressive, strong, sometimes muscular fighters who were highly trained and interesting to learn about all on their own. So I think it can be fun cinema to see this fantastical version of gladiators fighting on the screen. I just do think there should be more discussions online and perhaps within family and friend groups that it's not historically accurate. It is cinema, and people should not be made to feel bad that they're not at this peak level of fitness 365 days a year. This kind of thing also happens with Vikings. So Vikings are also a group that have been glorified as superhuman strong warriors on branding and advertising and in film and television. Sometimes with all of the Norse god legends, it can feel like those stories are factual when in truth they're fictional. Depictions of Vikings are that they are violent at the drop of a hat, transient, barbaric, and like gladiators, always built like bodybuilders. Stereotypically, there's this notion that they all had pale white skin, blue eyes, blonde hair, and unusual height and strength. This actually comes from a Viking mania in the US from the early 1800s through to the 1890s, I think. And this idea still has a hold over some people today. There was a book from the 1830s that tried to put together evidence that there was a Norse medieval presence in the Americas. People even identified items they believed were Viking related, such as an armored skeleton, a rock that was supposedly carved by the Vikings, and a tower that was built by the Vikings, which just turned out to be part of a windmill built in the 1700s. None of these items ended up being related to Vikings. A writer from 1879 attempted to link George Washington's ancestral roots to Odin. And then we can go all the way to 2013, where there were false claims of a Viking ship being found in Mississippi that circulated online, which ended up just being a longship housed in a Danish museum, a sword from Scotland, and a fake professor from the University of Memphis, Tennessee, that never existed. Some white Americans really want there to be Viking history in the US. I'll be honest and say that there are different layers of this Viking obsession. Some of them are racist, others are more of an interest in the time period and the historical side of things. I'm not going to dive any deeper into the more sinister side of Viking obsession today, because that's a whole video in and of itself, but just a taste to show you that these Vikings were not some superhuman perfect race with perfect genetics and hearty, healthy diets. I'm going to focus on the discrepancies of Viking health and strength in the past compared to how it is used as a marketing tactic today. But I don't want to not acknowledge that whole side of things. So Jordan and I went to the Jorvik Museum in York a few years back. He's from up north in England and always wanted to go, but for some reason we'd just not made the trip. So we went for his birthday with some friends, and I remember looking at some of the archaeology. There was one or two bodies discovered that I think had hip dysplasia and like a walking disability and severe deficiencies and maybe bone deterioration at like mid-30s, early 40s. And my brain was like, but this is a Viking. What do you mean they have hip dysplasia in their 30s? It's a Viking. And like 100% there were Vikings with disabilities. We have the example of Ivar the Boneless, so it was silly of me to even second guess this. It was just more of like oh duh, Vikings were just humans like we are. Like I was saying before, Vikings can often be seen as synonymous with the Norse god stories, so people can equate them to these superhuman beings. They just were humans walking the earth. What's more, though, is that their transient lifestyle meant that they were more prone to catch and spread diseases, drink contaminated water, or eat whatever was available to them, sometimes not always cooked properly. There are a couple of different examples of archaeology finds that show that Vikings were riddled with intestinal worms. First example of this is the Lloyd's Bank coprolite, which is just a fancy capitalistic name for Viking poo. I get having huge stadiums named after corporations or banks, racetracks, that sort of thing, but I draw the line at Viking poo. So you'll be excited to know this was a very intact poo that was discovered, which can give us good insight into the health of Vikings and what they ate. The Viking poo was riddled with intestinal worms, mostly from whatever the owner of the poo was eating, from meat and bread. There was another poo found from the Crusader period that had tapeworm eggs from fish, which meant that the parasites probably traveled around and people could catch them very easily. In Oxford, 35 skeletons of presumed Vikings were found ages 16 to 25 that might have been executed, and it was found that they also had mass worm infestations. There was a study done in 2016 that speculated that a gene developed by these Vikings to try and survive these worms and protect their vital organs may now be an inherited trait that can lead to emphysema, COPD, or lung cancer. The people who were studied, they think that there is a link in their genes between Vikings who were fighting off these worms in their systems and people now having serious lung issues. So if that is the case, this really does show that while it's impressive that they were able to develop a gene to fight off these worms, long term, their genes are not superior or superhuman for their descendants today. Richard Please said, Vikings would have eaten contaminated food, and parasites would have migrated to various organs, including lungs, where the proteases they released would cause disease. Diarrhea, stomach upsets, massive weight loss, blood loss, seizures, and death would have plagued Viking groups, mostly because of their bad hygiene and their close proximity to animals. While they ate a varied diet of fish and pork, that doesn't mean that they cooked it correctly. Another dig in Denmark of 50 skeletons revealed that, like gladiators, some of the Viking bones showed signs of healed fracture bones. I don't like to treat people in the past like they were always dumb about medicine or healing. That's why I've included this in here. Don't get me wrong, there were some crazy methods to attempting to heal people in the past. If you want to learn about the insane ways that Georgians attempted to heal gout and breathing issues, then this early, badly filmed video of mine is for you. But these findings that showed healed fractures or successful amputations show a level of advanced medical methods for the time period. However, being filled with worms from not properly heating bread or meat or sleeping with your cows, not so much. That dig also found that some of the bodies had degenerative diseases, which suggests a life of physical hardship and labor. This community appeared to be predominantly farmers with limited evidence of martial prowess. Additionally, the remains included women and children, showing the diverse roles within Viking society, not just those of warriors or raiders. Today, Vikings are synonymous with raw strength and battle readiness, as indicated by Viking fitness challenges where people flip tires and pull weights and climb over stuff. Like Gladiator branded stuff, there's the same kind of marketing for Vikings in mainly advertising. Vikings wearing a horned hat is a typical symbol for protein supplements, even though it's not historically accurate. There's no evidence of Vikings wearing horned battle hats. Being physically fit for our health is important. I don't have anything bad to say about like Viking fitness challenges. But what I do think we should remember is that the Viking age was about much more than brute strength. Vikings were men, women, and children. They were also skilled navigators, traders, and farmers who eventually built communities. By focusing solely on stereotypes of rage and power, we risk reducing their story to a one-dimensional caricature and perpetrating unrealistic expectations of what masculinity and strength should look like. The last historical group in this video is knights. I'm going to let Jordan take over for this one. He's researched this. He is interested in this time period and has done a lot of his own research in his free time and reads a lot of fiction that has knights in them. So I thought he'd be a better fit to talk about knights and some of the stereotypes that have developed over time to do with historic knights.
So the third group in our trifecta of manly men are the medieval knights. So whether that's the shining savior on a white horse or a hardcore helmeted guy who defeats the enemy and saves the day, knights have been transformed into something larger than life. So they kind of depict being a man in as unattainable a way as the gladiators and Vikings that we've already covered. When we look at what made a medieval knight, there are a few things in the historical record that put down the modern sense of a knight. First of all, they were more often than not completely warfare and violence free. So a knight might have seen one major conflict in their entire life and then spent the majority of their time lording over their peasant population on their fief, which was the land that the king had granted them in return for their vow of loyalty. And we often think of knights as big burly men that were absolute killing machines, capable of wielding a sword so expertly that they were able to defeat any unworthy opponent with ease. And why was it always a sword? Swords don't work on horseback as much as you think that they would, based on some of the films and the TV shows that we've seen. Historian Richard Cowper's research shows that the gallant knight on horseback, pennants and banners flying in the wind as they gallop down the tourney list, is a fiction of the 19th century. Hello again, Victorians. And they were looking back on the medieval period in a fit of romantic fervour. Warfare of any kind is a hellish experience, and it's more than likely that any knight who participated in many battles, or sometimes even one battle, would have what we now term as PTSD. Even then, there were whole knightly orders that eventually disappeared, not because of their military exploits, but because they literally had too much money, and the kings got real mad that they wouldn't share. In some senses, the knightly orders, so think of the Knights Templar of the Da Vinci Code, or the Knights Hospitaller, or the Teutonic Order, if any of these names are ringing a bell. And these all started as religious orders, essentially becoming mercenary companies that ravaged across the Middle East during the Crusades on behalf of their Catholic home countries. So the Templars were a French order, originally meant to protect pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land, but a large portion of their order was made up of non-combatants, and they dealt with money. Their financial techniques were basically a form of early banking. Now remember, when we're talking about some of these crusades and the early knightly orders, we're kind of thinking in a range of the year 1000 AD to 1200 AD, and a banker isn't exactly the epitome of medieval chivalry. But wait, let's be fair, the Knights Templar themselves were founded around the year 1119, and the chivalry concept was not really a thing until quite a few decades later in 1170 to 1220. So maybe the whole lend a bunch of money to the King of France until he gets mad and gets the Pope to declare your order null wasn't really their fault, but I think we got a little bit off track there. Chivalry was the knightly code of honor and is something that gets referenced a lot, even today. They say that chivalry is dead, but was it ever really alive? Unlike a term like feudalism, chivalry was actually a medieval invention. It was something that medieval thinkers believed was a state to aspire to. It was something that they should try and be. Chivalry, much like the Knights Templar, was a French creation, but it spread throughout Western Europe like wildfire. The problem with chivalry, however, is that much like the original American Constitution, it didn't apply to everybody equally. The reason that the knightly orders were able to go into the Holy Land and protect innocent pilgrims is because being chivalrous only counted when interacting with fellow noblemen. Oh yeah, knights were nobles first and foremost. Those peasants, Jews, Muslims, pagans, or the heretics over there, yeah, they don't count. Do what you want to them, and we'll let it slide. So in modern media, we see knights in various places, from video games to film and television, from more accurate to less accurate, depending on the source material. But they're used so widely because they're a massive part of Western culture generally. There are even camps that you can send your young boys to, ages 7 to 16, because Knights Camp captivates every boy's God-given thirst for adventure. And the campers are encouraged to uphold integrity, honor, and courage. Now look, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but isn't it funny how a medieval concept for battlefield strength kind of morphed into this gentlemanly thing over time? And that's without even going into the fact that the modern gentleman, another Victorian thing, by the way, basically evolved from the chivalrous knight in the first place. So in terms of some of the films that depict knights, and slightly more accurately than some video games, for example, would be Arn, the Knight Templar. It's the most expensive Swedish film production to date, about 210 million krona, which equates to about 30 million US dollars. And it had some great swordplay and horsemanship in that knightly period drama. And then Ridley Scott's take was Kingdom of Heaven, and this is knights rather than gladiators. And some academics say that the fanaticism that the Christians are portrayed as in that film is not quite historical. For example, Professor Dawn Marie Hayes states, many students felt that Kingdom of Heaven was enjoyable on a cinematic level, but cautioned against being deceived by its historical values, highlighting the perception of deliberate misleading in historical representation. So it wasn't really until those Victorian idealists got their hands on the chivalric code that it became the ideal of being something good to everyone, and not just to your titled mates that own the next village over. So in the Middle Ages, your chivalrous acts were pretty much confined to the battlefield. How effectively you stood and held against an enemy, because being charged was a very scary thing, was a measure of how chivalrous you were being. So when we use chivalrous knights as these gentlemanly figures with higher moral codes than us, we're kind of forgetting that for many of them, profit was king over virtue. And we're kind of also forgetting that there are stories of kidnapping women and forcing them to become their brides, and they were romanticized, whereas now that would definitely get you arrested. So, just like the Old Norse stories, I think tales of knights can be really interesting. So, we live in North Wales, and the stories of King Arthur and his knights kind of feel so connected to the landscape here, to the national park, Uri, and the mountains. It can be really interesting to dive deeply into the different versions of the legends of Arthur throughout the UK. However, I think it's important to see these stories for what they were, legends that have been reimagined and rewritten depending on the people, the time period, where they were from.
To wrap up here, I quickly wanted to add a historical group that I think can sometimes be co-opted into this whole buff, strong man with limited emotions narrative, and that is working class men in the past, particularly in the 1800s. My heart is really in industrial heritage. I think it's so important to highlight the lives of mining, quarrying, or agricultural communities. For so long, all of these blue-collar positions, although many of them were highly trained, were looked down on as physically demanding jobs that anyone could do. Now, I do think, funnily enough, we do have a bit of a shift where you can hear people saying, oh, all these men behind desks, men used to work in mines or blow up mountains or lead cattle off into the great beyond, as some sort of a way to say that that's when men were real men, when they were hardworking, when they were strong and healthy. When in reality, that's just not the case. For a lot of these men in the Victorian and Edwardian periods, the pay was absolutely abysmal. They could not afford to feed their families. These men were malnourished. Some of them were really small. We think of these hard laboring men in the past and we think bulging muscles while they repair old cars. But when you look at photographs and you actually get into the archives and read stories on these groups, a lot of them were tiny. Some of them were frail and working in horrible, dangerous conditions in all sorts of weather climates. Some lost limbs or developed cancer from breathing in dust. We glorify cowboys from the 1800s as these rough and tumble men, but history shows us that this nomadic lifestyle sometimes meant the men weren't able to access nutritious food. They sometimes would ingest contaminated water or develop easily prevented diseases today. Having muscles from a physical job in the past because there were very few other options for working class people, or I'm also thinking of enslaved people now who are doing very demanding physical work out in the heat. Just because those people had muscles, that doesn't equate to healthiness. It's a byproduct of the work that has to be done, but not a symbol of healthiness and strength or a reason to look down on people now for having safe, sedentary jobs. Now, is that a separate discussion on so many of us sitting all day long and staring at computers, and that this is absolutely not great for our health? Yes. I'm not saying that the way that the corporate world has gone is in need of glorification either, but these historical workers had really hard lives, and using them as examples of strength and masculinity to shame others is not the way to go. These tropes can alienate men who don't fit the mold, or it can conflate queerness with weakness when there's evidence in the case of gladiators that queer intimacy was common. For Vikings, sometimes women are forgot about altogether in the equation. I think we're learning more about the possibility of female gladiators, but I don't want to talk too definitively about that because I don't know too much about it. But period dramas can be co-opted to use historically inaccurate portrayals to create hypermasculine heroes that resonate with modern anxieties about gender and power. Those tropes being used in fitness, lifestyle branding, and political rhetoric often perpetuate a narrow definition of masculinity, focusing on physical dominance and competitive strength while disregarding the vulnerabilities and complex realities of these historical groups. As a period drama lover, I'm not advocating for these historical action films to be completely accurate. I definitely enjoyed watching Paul Mescal in Gladiator 2, I'm not going to lie to you. The world is hard enough as it is right now that I think we should be able to go to the theater and watch a fun movie. However, I believe that the more we understand about the difference between fact and fiction when we watch these films, the more we can appreciate these stories for what they are, rather than feeling pressure to idolize historical figures who lived harsh, challenging lives. Let's normalize leaving a theater without comparing ourselves to the superhuman characters on screen, and without making those stories make us feel inadequate. Most importantly, let's not allow companies to use stereotypical representations of groups like Vikings, knights, and gladiators to exploit and profit off of our insecurities in the process. Thanks for watching. I keep saying one day I'm just going to make a fun, laid-back video that doesn't have like dark and heavy themes. And here we go again. Subscribe!